This video is sponsored by Flexispot. Stay tuned to see how you can get a great deal on your next desk. Greetings, my excellent friends. It's Josh Cripps here, and in this video, I wanted to talk about how I first started post-processing in the very early days of my photography career. The things that I did well, the things that I did very not well, and the lessons that I've learned over the years and where I went wrong to develop a comprehensive post-processing solution. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now what I'm showing you here is a photo that I took in New Zealand way back in 2007. So these were the very early days when I was interested in landscape photography. And the way that this is processed, I did all of my processing at the time in Photoshop. So when I would have an image like this, you can see over here in my layers panel, I've got 4 layers going on. A background layer, curves layer, another layer, and another curves layer. So let's take a look at each of these individually and it'll explain what I'm doing. So here's what my basic layer looks like, and then I would apply some contrast to that. And then I've got maybe a sky layer and I would apply some contrast to that and then just smash them all up on top of each other. And this is essentially what my processing was like for every image that I created at that time. I would look at different parts of an image, I would make some adjustments to that part, and then I would throw them together as layers in Photoshop. So let me jump over to an image that's just a little bit more complex, but I'll show you how I had the exact same approach no matter what was going on. This is a photo from Aoraki Mount Cook National Park, also in New Zealand, taken on the same trip in 2007. And you can see if I look at my layers panel over here, I have kind of the same thing going on. I've got all these layers stacked up on top of each other, all these individual adjustments kind of applying just to part of the photo. So if I go and I turn all these off, here's what my background layer looks like. And let's just see what all of these individual layers do. Okay, I'm gonna turn this one on. We've got some sort of brightening the foreground layer, okay? And then we've got a curves adjustment, which applies just to that layer. And let's see what it does. For some reason, I'm darkening it back down. I have no idea why I'm doing that. Okay, that's just helping make the trees pop. So really the effect of this layer is making those trees pop. Now I've got a copy of the background layer here, and what does this one do? If I turn this on and off, that is actually pulling down the highlights. So apparently I was looking at this thinking the highlights are too bright, I better dampen them down a little bit. Next up is a selective color layer, and that's just adding a little bit of darkness to the sky. And the way that I did this is in the cyan channel and the blue channel, simply increasing the black content. So this is kind of a strange way to do this, but by making these individual color channels darker by adding black, it's helping with the richness of the sky. Now I've got a curves layer, and this is adding some contrast to the foreground. Yeah, simple S curve. Now this curves layer is adding some contrast to the sky there. And finally, I've got another curves layer that's brightening up the foreground. So you can see it's like applying a layer of paint on top of a layer of paint on top, and just stacking all this up. So you end up with this very unsophisticated approach to your processing. Now, really quickly, I do want to say that this early processing style of mine, it actually has a lot of merit in a sense. So philosophically, what I was doing back in the day, 14 years ago, looking at each individual part of a photograph, making an adjustment to that part alone, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? One of the problems with global adjustments, whether you're in Photoshop or Lightroom, is that oftentimes a sky doesn't require the same level of, let's say, an exposure increase as a foreground does, or the same level of contrast, or you shouldn't necessarily apply the same amount of dehazing to a forest that's right in front of your face as some clouds that are way off in the distance. Looking at all these individual parts of an image and trying to create a unique adjustment for that part, that's actually a very intelligent way to do your processing, and that's more or less how I process now. But the problem with doing it the way that I was doing it, all of these individual pixel layers and all of these individual adjustment layers here in Photoshop, is that it's very destructive. And if I zoom in here and you take a look at the sky, you can see there is so much posterization and color banding and noise and JPEG artifacting and really, really ugly, crunchy sort of square details in the mountains here in the background. And a lot of that comes simply because by stacking pixel layer on top of pixel layer, you lose your ability to undo things. And so if I were to create a sharpened layer from my background layer, well, now all of my adjustments are just taking place on top of that sharpened layer instead of some raw background layer that I can go back and undo. And so it creates all of these ugly artifacts. So let me show you now how I would actually approach this exact same photograph today. Now, instead of using Photoshop and all these different individual adjustment layers, pretty much all of my editing takes place in Lightroom. So hang tight, I'm gonna switch over to Lightroom and get started there. Nature photography is supposed to be all about getting outside and taking pictures, right? But of course, this post-processing element is behind the computer. And so I just want to take a quick minute to talk about the sponsor of this video, Flexispot, because when you spend as much time behind the computer learning how to post-process and preparing your image, it's important that you have the right tools that help you be productive and help you do it comfortably. And having a quality desk is certainly part of the suite of tools that I rely on to be able to get my work done. And this desk right here is an electronic adjustable standing and sitting desk from Flexispot. And it basically allows me to work sitting down or with a touch of a button to work standing up. The adjustment process is actually really easy. You can program in a couple of different set points. There's 4 different set heights that you can do. And this was actually my first standing desk, and I'm surprised how much I use and I like the standing part of it. So I'd say I probably work about 60% of my day sitting down and another 40% standing up. So check out the description below. There's a link down there to all of Flexispot's desks. If you need a new desk, a really high quality, helpful, productivity enhancing desk, check out that link. Check out all the desks from Flexispot. All right, well, I'm here in Lightroom with the raw file from that photograph from Aoraki Mount Cook National Park. And this is how I would approach editing this image now, sort of with that same mindset of looking at the individual parts of the photograph to assess what they need, but trying to do as much as possible here in the raw file to preserve image quality. Now you'll notice first off that this photo is still using the super old version of the Lightroom processing engine. So I'm gonna update that first of all. Go down here to my calibration and change that to version 5. So that's gonna give me all of the tools that I'm used to now here within Lightroom. But regardless of the tools that you're using, the main takeaway here really is moving away from pixel-based editing and layer-based editing where you're doing adjustments specifically to the actual pixels in an image. It's super destructive. And moving toward a raw adjustment where you have the non-destructive abilities to undo and change your adjustments at any point. And it's not like putting layer after layer after layer of paint on top of an image. Okay, so now that I've got a better, let's change this profile as well from camera flat, which didn't exist on my Nikon D50 that I shot with, but camera neutral did. You'll see that helps me bring out some of the shadows and pull down some of the highlights a little bit more. It's just a little bit cleaner of a starting point to begin with. Now, the sky is definitely a little bright. I want to try to consolidate some of those tones a little bit. So I'm going to pull those down and I'm going to pull up the shadows. Just some basic overall global adjustments. Now, again, keeping in mind that when you're doing post-processing, there's nothing wrong with doing a global adjustment and calling it good. That's totally fine. In terms of getting the most out of your photographs, it's helpful to start thinking about how do the different parts of your image need to be approached differently. Again, I'm probably not going to sharpen these trees in the foreground the same way that I want to sharpen the big bulk details of the mountain in the background. So after just a few simple global adjustments, my mind is going to be moving towards that local side of things. I'm just zoomed in here to kind of get a sense of what this image needs overall. There's a pretty good amount of detail in these trees here, although it is quite soft just because Nikon D50 is only a 6 megapixel camera And you know, I wasn't using maybe the best quality lenses back then. So you can see these trees over here are pretty soft. But overall, I mean, there's an acceptable level of detail there. Now the background, well, it's looking even softer. So I know I'm probably gonna wanna be a little more aggressive with my texture and clarity and sharpening back there than I would be on my trees here in the foreground. So sometimes I'll play with these global sliders in the clarity and texture just to kind of get a sense of what effect they are bringing out. And I like what the clarity is doing. It's helping just with a little bit more shadow detail, a little bit more local contrast on some of those in the background, and it's bringing out some of the details. So I'm going to do just that clarity adjustment there. That's totally fine. Now texture, that'll help bring out micro contrast, and if you want a little bit more of a glowy look, you can turn that down, a little more painterly look, and if you want a little more harsher look, you can bring that up. But again, it's important to be looking at the different parts of your image to see how it's affecting them. And a lot of times for me, I really like a softer, more painterly look on my forests with a little bit more texture than on my mountains. So in this case, I think I'm gonna skip using a texture adjustment, a global one, and I'll just go and I'll do that via local adjustments. Now let's take a look and see what dehazing does here. Yeah, I think the dehaze is gonna be really effective in this image. Just to bring out some of the details in the back, but notice how it's making the blues really saturated in the shadows, so we'll deal with that a little bit later. Now I don't necessarily, again, want to do global saturation and vibrance. You know, this image is quite blue dominated, and I maybe want to treat the blues differently than some of these other colors. So I'll do a tiny little adjustment on those just to get it going. But past that, I'm going to do everything locally. Okay, now the next thing that I want to do is I want to pull down the sky a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my Darkened Skies grad here, and I'm just going to pull it across like that. And this just helps me consolidate the brightest and darkest tones in the image so that when I apply a little bit of contrast, they don't get clipped on either side of things. So that is an okay place to start. I don't necessarily love what it's doing to the color tone of the image. It's starting to look a little dingy and green. So let me add just a little bit of magenta there. And we can start to even out some of that shadow tone there. A little bit of warmth. Okay, how's that looking? Yeah, that's not too bad. Now we can brighten up the whole image. I want to shift some of these cyan tones here a little bit more towards a blue, so I'm just going to do that with the HSL here. Okay, yeah, that's helping those shadows look a little more natural. I don't like how much contrast or how much it's made that part saturated there, so I'm just going to grab a adjustment brush and I'm going to desaturate that. Okay, that may be a little overkill, and then of course I had a little bit of spillover here onto the mountain, so let me grab the eraser and I'm going to mask the eraser. Oh, I need to turn the flow up. No wonder it's not doing anything. There we go. So that'll help me erase along the border there. Now, one thing you could do to really make your images pop is play with different kinds of contrast, such as color contrast. Now, because I have all these blues in the sky, I think I can help them stand out a little bit by adding a little bit more warm tones here in the foreground. So let me put on another gradient tool, and I'm just going to zero this out, and I'm going to add a little bit of warmth and a little bit of magenta, and I'll just put that on just so it's basically over the trees there. I always try to make these adjustments subtle. You don't want it to be, you don't want those trees to be pink necessarily. And one way you can figure out if your adjustments are too strong or not is to go overkill on them. You know, do it to the maximum and then just pull it back until the effects sort of fades away and doesn't look obvious anymore. And that's a good stopping point. Okay, There we go, very nice. Now, this image overall is looking pretty good, but what I want to do now is start to enhance the detail throughout the image. And again, the foreground's likely going to need a different kind of detail enhancement than the sky is. And in the past, what I would have done is basically created a copy of the foreground layer, sharpened it, used a mask to paint in just that part, then created a copy of the sky layer, and then sharpened that part and used a mask to paint that in. And it would have resulted in this really ugly, low image quality thing. But we have these tools now where we can do it here entirely on the raw file. So let's start with the trees here in the foreground. Now, I have built a few custom brushes, quite a few custom tools for myself here within Lightroom. If you want to learn more about these kinds of custom tools, about local editing and creating tools for yourself, things like quick tools for darkening the sky, for dodging, for creating a fog effect, or for creating Orton glow or enhancing detail. I'll put a link up here in the video description. I've got a course and a toolkit that you can check out that goes through all of this stuff. So for this one, I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to grab my detail sharpening brush and I'm going to zoom in on this foreground. The ways that you can enhance detail within Lightroom, you basically want to be playing with your sharpening, your texture, and your clarity. And adjusting those different kinds of contrast can help you bring out the details on different scales within the image. Now, because there's a lot of fine detail here in these trees, I'm mostly going to focus on bringing out those fine details. Now you can see this is having a great effect, especially on these trees here in the midground that are getting hit with the sunlight, that this little brush here is really helping those details come out nice and clean. And I just love that you have the ability to control this effect locally. And you can add as much or as little as you want. And after you've applied it, you can reduce the amount, right? One of the problems with the way that I approached editing when I first got started is you would lock in an edit on that pixel layer. The amount of sharpening or the amount of color saturation would be locked in, and you can't really subtly adjust that after the fact. But here with these raw tools, you absolutely can. So if I find that this is too much sharpening or it's creating some funky artifacts over here on the edge where these trees are extremely soft, you know, I can go ahead and I can erase that to get rid of some of those artifacts. And then maybe I'll go in with a different brush. Like this is my custom sharpening brush, but I also have a custom detail enhancement brush, which plays with things in a different way. So rather than adding sharpening, it basically tries to increase texture and contrast. And that's probably a better choice for some of these soft trees here on the edge where their details are a little bit fuzzier. Now let me play with some of this. Yeah, you can see how this detail enhancement brush is also letting me bring out the sort of larger scale details in the midground. Great. Now really where I'm curious to see how this is going to have an effect is on these background elements. So you can see the details look quite soft through the mountain here. Let's just see what the detail enhancement brush does for me. Okay, so let me go ahead and I'm going to just paint around this area in the back here with my detail enhancement brush. And you can see it's helping bring out some of these little micro contrasty areas to add that sense of increased detail. So let me turn that on and off now. And that really helps those details there in the background pop in a way that is different from the way that I want the details in the foreground to pop. So that's working quite effectively. And what I like about doing it this way is I can make sure that my adjustments, my sharpening and detail enhancement don't impact these clouds, for example. I don't want the clouds to be sharpened. They shouldn't be sharpened. Okay, I just want to make a couple more quick adjustments here. I think I want to bring out some more of the trees here in the foreground, so I'm going to use my shadow brush. And I'm just going to lift up some of the shadows there of those trees so they're not quite as dark. There we go. Just bringing up those shadows. That looks pretty good. Cool, cool. And let's add another one. I don't want the shadows in the clouds to be quite so dark. So I'll go ahead and just drop the dehazing and do that on that so it doesn't look quite so crunchy in the clouds. Beautiful. Now we're basically to the last step, which is the cleanup noise reduction. I apparently never cleaned my image sensor when I was shooting with this camera. And so, yeah, boy, there are a lot of dust spots. So thankfully it's only a 6 megapixel image and this should be relatively quick to do here in Lightroom. Now, if you have a lot of image cleanup that you need to do on your photographs, I highly recommend doing it in Photoshop. It is so much faster and so much better. But for these speckles here, I'm not too worried about this. All right, now with that done, there's just one last step that I want to do in terms of final image cleanup, which is get rid of some of the noise here in this photo. And you can use the noise reduction here in Lightroom, but it's not my favorite. It works for small levels of noise, but if you apply it heavily for really noisy images, it tends to smear out the details. So instead of using these built-in tools, what I'm going to do instead is send this over to Photoshop as a smart object, and the plugin that I use is called Neat Image. It works beautifully for noise reduction. Now you can use it as a plugin in Lightroom, but I want to just compare this photo to the one that I processed 14 years ago, which is living in Photoshop right now. So that's why I'm just sending it over there so I can do a direct comparison. All right, so here we go, we got it, and let's go ahead and just bring up Filter, Neat Image, Reduced Noise. And what this lets you do is select a part of the photo, you know, try to find an area that's got maybe the most noise. There, wait, yeah, that'll be okay. Hit the profile button. It'll tell you how good of a job it's done quality-wise in terms of figuring out the noise profile. Hit apply, and boom, there you go. Let me zoom into 100% now, and you can see this area in the mountains here, which was quite noisy before, is now very nice and smooth, but I haven't lost any of those fine details. And then, of course, the sky is beautifully smooth versus the tiny little bit of noise that was in there. Now, the main thing at this point is this is a pretty done looking image. I'd be happy to call this a day, but what's really going to be the crucial test here is comparing it to the photo that I processed years ago. So I'm just going to slap this one on top of the other one, and just for expediency's sake, I'm going to flatten it before I move it. It just goes faster that way. And I'm going to put it here. Okay, now we can have a look at the before and the after. And I specifically want to just kind of take a look the overall image. You know, there's a slight color difference here and there. You know, that doesn't really bother me too much. That's just your individual sensibilities change over the years, and you can always make color adjustments really easily. I'm more curious about the image quality and the detail level. So let's move up here and look at the sky. This is the before, and you could see how much noise, how much posterization and banding is present in the sky versus the current image. It's so clean and smooth. Now, what about the details in the mountains here? So this is the old file. Now, a lot of those details basically look like they're rendered out as 8-bit blocks. They're just squares. You know, there's hardly any actual detail in there. Look at this area right here. It's just a collection of different colored blue pixels, whereas now you can actually see the detail and lines and topology, you know, the texture of that rock feature. And that's the case throughout all of this area here. So let's take a look at these colored hills here. Again, just those details are so crunchy in the old one, and they're so much more refined and clean in the new one. Now, what about our forest? How about the details in the forest? All right, now these bare larches here, they're looking really nice. They're a little bit over sharpened, I'd say, in the old one. And so I'm much happier with the level of detail now. It's a little bit softer, it's a little bit more elegant as opposed to just everything is super crunchy, everything is super sharp approach. So there you have it. I'd say the main takeaways from this experience are: have that local editing mindset, looking at the individual parts of a photograph to determine what they need. And I think that's something that I did very well back in the day. It's just that my practical approach to applying those edits was extremely destructive, and not to mention inefficient, by stacking up all of these individual pixel layers with all of these adjustment layers and really creating these ugly, low quality images. And so by taking that approach of having the local mindset when it comes to image editing and knowing how to use the tools, whether it's in Adobe Camera Raw or within Lightroom, to apply your adjustments locally to work with the raw file, you're going to create a much higher quality photograph. That is all for this one. Thank you very, very much for watching. If you found this video helpful and you're not already subscribed to the channel, please hit that button. It really does help me out, helps grow the channel so that I can continue to make more content like this. So that's going to do it for me. Until next time, have fun and happy shooting.